Shout out to all the new supporters who we met yesterday in Bernal Heights and the Bayview. I'm looking forward to meeting more in the Richmond today. Couple thoughts about last week's tragic events in Uvalde, Texas. I'm going to break this down first in this first video into policy issues. I'll address political issues in a second one. But in the policy sphere, there's a bunch of lessons that we need to learn. Some of them relate to gun violence, some of them relate to policing, and there's a constitutional riff here as it relates to the Supreme Court that needs to come on the table. So let's just dive into it. From a policy standpoint, this is yet another example. There are dozens, there are hundreds of examples of how gun violence threatens public safety. And the idea that we allow assault weapons on the streets to easily fall into the hands of maniacs is senseless. It is absolutely idiotic. And children are paying the price. It's not acceptable that around the country right now, kids are cowering in fear of going to school. And they shouldn't have to be grateful for making it home at night. It's preposterous. Usually when we talk about people making it home at night, we're talking about service members, not school children. Policy solutions, the very first. We have to revive the assault weapons ban. When it was in place for 10 years, it was very effective in reducing the number of gun deaths in this country. That's not rocket science. It shouldn't surprise anyone. We also have to close the loopholes that allow access to firearms without completing background checks. Unlicensed sellers are basically in a world unto their own. We have to close that loophole. That also should not be controversial. This next piece gets tricky. It implicates capital. In 2005, Congress passed a law, the PCLAA, Protecting Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. It's like a series of other measures that Congress has also passed to immunize corporations from civil liability. Congress did the same thing 4 years later to protect the telecom industry. This was a few years before the Snowden revelations explained why people would have otherwise rights against the telecom industry, but Congress bent over backward to insulate it from facing any liability, just like it did in 2005 with gun manufacturers. Gun manufacturers have greater protections from civil liability than even tobacco producers or car manufacturers. And what sense does that make, given the threat that gun violence poses to public health? No one should be making a buck off of other people dying. There's an extension here with respect to the Pentagon and weapons. I don't want to chase that rabbit too far. I want to stay moving beyond gun violence. We've talked about the repealing the 2005 liability protections for the gun industry. We talked about expanding background checks and reviving the assault weapons ban. Another thing we need to do that Uvalde should teach everyone is recognize finally that cops lie pervasively. They're trained to. They lie from the streets to the courtroom to congressional hearings. I was arrested in the Senate in 2015 for just asking a question of the nation's top intelligence official, the Director of National Intelligence, who lied to Congress under oath in 2013. His lies were revealed and proven by whistleblowers, and he never faced any accountability for it. In fact, that person has a pension. While Eric Garner and Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Alex Nieto and Mario Woods and Oscar Grant and too many people, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, met untimely demises, including the 19 kids in Uvalde because the police refused to show up for work and then lied about it to try to cover their own asses. And we should recognize that pattern of disinformation from public authorities. This stretches from police to the Director of National Intelligence. And this is a problem writ large. As an attendant sort of extension of that recognition of police lying, we have to be appropriately skeptical of the press. We would hope that the press would have the independence to expose these lies. It's why the press exists. And we know, unfortunately, that the press lacks either that interest and increasingly even the capacity to perform that function. Malcolm X said in a different era that if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing, and newspapers today demonstrate that pattern over and over again. I want to offer one particular example. The San Francisco Chronicle, owned by the Hearst Corporation, is a disinformation outlet. There are two races on the ballot currently on the June 7th ballot. Ours to replace Pelosi and Prop H. It's a proposal to recall our democratically elected district attorney, Chesa Boudin. The Chronicle has been relentlessly publishing disinformation, constructing a supposed crime wave, despite the fact that crime remains at a historic low. We are currently in federal court defending election integrity from racist fabrications by that newspaper and the active, malicious, and reckless suppression of facts that bore very crucially on a public story. In both of these instances, this is the Chronicle bending over backward to serve power, to serve the industrial complex surrounding predatory policing and industrial slavery, and the corrupt oligarch who's represented this city in Congress for the last 35 years. We have to recognize that cops lie. We have to recognize that newspapers help them. And we have to act accordingly. We have to be informed. One of the things that we might do if we're informed and aware that cops lie and newspapers reinforce them is make better decisions about how to allocate our public safety resources. At the moment, and it has long been the case, that policymakers presume falsely that police keep us safe. There has never been in our country a more obvious refutation of that canard than the events last week in Uvalde, Texas. Police don't keep us safe. They frankly never have. That's not their mission. Their mission is to protect capital. And when we look at cops lying to cover their ass because they won't show up for work, that might suggest to us when, incidentally, the murderer who killed those kids was known to authorities. He'd been flagged before. So why are we hurling money down the black hole of predatory policing when there are frankly cheaper alternatives that could keep people alive by particularly funding community violence intervention and prevention programs? That's where I would like to shift some resources. We need to invest in better alternatives to promote public safety, undeterred by the self-serving lies of police departments and the newspapers that support them. There's a whole other set of political implications from Uvalde. I'll get into those in a separate video. But again, just to recap some of the policy solutions. We have to expand background checks. We have to revive the assault weapons ban. We have to end the liability protections that protect the gun lobby and the gun industry for the deaths that their business model promotes. And we have to shift some resources from an industrial slavery model predicated on hyper-armed paramilitary agents who refuse to show up for work and then lie to cover their asses, to social workers and people who can actually we can put in a position to stop these acts of violence, these senseless, murderous acts of violence that have left millions of school children terrified across this country, to better protect them. We have better alternatives. Let's embrace them. This is not rocket science. It's simple sanity. And I would plead with you for sanity. On the 7th of June, it's the last day to vote in our election. Vote for us to replace Pelosi, Shahid Buttar, and vote no on Prop H to stand with Chesa and force justice on a criminal justice system that has unfortunately grown criminally unjust. More next.